Elijah had always been a quiet, reserved kid. He wasn't the kind of person to draw attention to himself. His world was small but meaningful. His family, his friends, and his dog, Max. Max was no ordinary dog. He wasn't just a companion. He was Elijah's protector, his confidant, and the one creature in the world who always understood him. Max was a large, strong dog, loyal and fiercely protective of Elijah. The bond they shared went beyond that of a typical pet and owner. Elijah found comfort in Max's presence, something no one else could give him. For as long as Elijah could remember, his days had been spent walking to school with Max by his side, or playing with him in the yard after school. But lately Elijah's life had begun to shift in a way that made him uncomfortable. It all started when a group of older kids at school began to target him. At first it was just the usual teasing, the kind that most kids experienced in one way or another. But for Elijah it felt different. It wasn't just simple name-calling. There was an underlying cruelty to it that made him feel isolated. The bullies mocked him, not just for being quiet or different, but for the way he looked. They often made remarks about his skin as if it were something to be ashamed of. Elijah tried to ignore them. He had been taught to never respond to insults, to keep his head down and stay out of trouble. But every day it felt harder and harder to do just that. The taunts came from all directions, and the words seemed to sting more than ever. Sometimes they would shout things from across the yard. Other times they'd try to trip him in the hallway. Elijah couldn't figure out what had triggered their hatred. But the truth was, it didn't really matter. For them, it seemed like he was just an easy target. They found joy in making him feel small. One particular afternoon, as Elijah walked home with Max, he saw them again. The group of bullies was gathered at the corner of the street, laughing and shouting. Elijah's heart sank. He could already tell they were looking for trouble. He didn't want to deal with them today. He just wanted to get home, to be with Max where he felt safe. But the moment the bullies spotted him, they began to approach. "Look who it is," one of them sneered. Elijah kept walking, hoping they would just leave him alone. But they didn't. "Hey, dog boy," another one called out. "What's your stupid mutt doing today?" The mocking laughter echoed in the air. Elijah tightened his grip on Max's leash. He could feel the dog's muscles tense, sensing the tension in the air. Elijah knew Max wouldn't hesitate to protect him, but he also knew Max wasn't supposed to be involved in this. He was just a dog, and this wasn't his fight. Elijah was determined to get through this without letting his emotions get the best of him. But then the leader of the group, a tall boy with a sneer on his face, stepped forward. "Is that your dog, huh? What a joke. Probably doesn't even know how to fetch a stick," he mocked, laughing with his friends. Elijah felt his blood begin to boil. He wanted to say something, to stand up for himself and for Max, but he knew that if he did, things would only get worse. Max, however, had a different idea. The dog growled low, his ears flattening against his head. Elijah pulled on the leash, trying to calm him down, but it was too late. One of the bullies kicked at Max, causing the dog to yelp in pain. Elijah's heart stopped. "No," he cried, rushing to Max's side. But before he could reach the dog, another bully grabbed hold of him, shoving him back. "Stay out of this, freak," the boy hissed. Elijah struggled, trying to break free, but the bullies had surrounded him. He could feel his pulse racing. Max was still on the ground, trembling, and Elijah could tell the dog was hurt. He could feel the helplessness rising inside him. The bullies didn't care. They kept kicking at Max, laughing as they did. Elijah couldn't hold back any longer. His hands clenched into fists, and he struggled harder against the boy who held him. "Stop," Elijah shouted, his voice desperate. "Stop hurting him." But the words fell on deaf ears. The leader of the group kicked Max again, and the dog whimpered in pain. Elijah's chest tightened, and before he knew what was happening, he broke free. In one swift movement, he lunged at the bully who was tormenting Max. He grabbed the boy's arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing him to the ground. The other bullies stood frozen, unsure of what to do. They hadn't expected this. Elijah wasn't a fighter. He was just a kid who kept to himself. But in that moment, something inside him snapped. The boy under Elijah's grip struggled to break free, but Elijah held firm. He had never felt such power in his own body before. The feeling was foreign to him, but it was also liberating. The bullies were too shocked to intervene as Elijah shoved the boy to the ground. Max, sensing his owner's anger, stood up, tail wagging, ready to defend Elijah. "Get off me," the bully yelled, but Elijah didn't listen. He wasn't going to let them hurt Max anymore. The fight continued for a few more moments. Elijah had no idea how to fight or what to do, but instinct took over. He knew he had to protect Max. The bullies tried to grab him, but they quickly realized they weren't going to win this fight. Elijah's anger was stronger than any fear they could throw at him. With each move, he pushed them further back until the bullies finally realized they were outmatched. They stumbled back, unsure of what to do next. One by one, they backed away, glancing at each other in confusion and fear. Max stood by Elijah's side, wagging his tail as if to say, "You did it." The bullies didn't say another word. They turned and ran, leaving Elijah and Max standing in the street. Elijah's breath came in quick, shallow gasps. He looked down at Max, who was now licking his hand as if to comfort him. Elijah had never felt this kind of relief before. He had just stood up for himself for Max. It wasn't the way he had expected things to go, but it had happened. Max was safe. And for the first time in a long while, Elijah felt like he had done something right. The sun hung low in the sky as Elijah and Max made their way home, the air still and heavy after the chaos of earlier. The streets were quieter now, and for a moment Elijah allowed himself to breathe, to take in the calmness around him. His heart was still racing from the encounter, but the adrenaline was slowly wearing off. He glanced down at Max, who trotted alongside him, his tail wagging lightly. The dog's presence was a comfort, as always. Max didn't need words to understand Elijah's mood. He just stayed close, a silent protector. It had all happened so quickly. One moment he was walking home, trying to keep his head down and avoid the bullies, and the next he had found himself in the middle of a fight. Elijah had never wanted to fight anyone, let alone the bullies who had tormented him for so long. He had always been taught to walk away, to ignore the cruel words and actions of others. But today was different. He couldn't stand by and let them hurt Max. The one creature in his life who had never judged him. Max had been there through everything. Through the loneliness, the bullying, and the times when Elijah felt like no one cared. Max was his constant companion, and Elijah had promised to always look out for him. As they neared the house, Elijah's mind was spinning with what had happened. The bullies had run off, but he knew they wouldn't forget what had happened. He had seen the fear in their eyes as they realized Elijah wasn't the easy target they thought he was. But that didn't mean they were done with him. Elijah had no doubt that they would find some other way to make his life miserable. They weren't the type to just walk away quietly. The thought of facing them again made Elijah's stomach turn. He didn't want to fight. He didn't want to have to prove anything to anyone. But he knew that the next time he crossed paths with them, things might not go as smoothly. He wasn't prepared for the kind of attention this would bring, but there was no going back now. He had shown them a side of him they hadn't expected, and there was no telling how they would react to that. When they reached home, Elijah was met with the familiar sight of his mom's car in the driveway. He felt a wave of relief wash over him. At least he was home. His mom, a strong woman who had raised him on her own, was always there to listen when he needed to talk. Elijah had always been close to her, even though he didn't share much about the struggles he faced at school. His mom had enough on her plate, and he didn't want to burden her with his problems. But today was different. He knew he couldn't keep this to himself. Max followed Elijah inside, his paws tapping against the floor as he trotted through the door. Elijah paused for a moment to close the door behind him before heading to the kitchen, where his mom was preparing dinner. She looked up as he walked in, a smile forming on her face as she saw him, but the smile quickly faded when she saw the look on his face. "Elijah, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Elijah hesitated. For a moment, unsure of how to explain what had happened. He didn't want to worry her, but he knew she could see through his silence. "It's nothing, Mom, just a bad day at school," he said, trying to downplay it. But his mom wasn't buying it. She set the knife down and walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Elijah, I know you better than that. You can't hide things from me." "What happened?" she asked gently, her eyes soft but serious. Elijah sighed and ran a hand through his hair. He wanted to avoid talking about it, but he knew he couldn't keep it from her. I got into a fight," he admitted quietly. His mom's eyebrows lifted in surprise. Elijah wasn't a fighter. He had always avoided confrontation, keeping to himself as much as possible. "A fight?" she asked. "With who?" "With some of the guys at school," Elijah said, looking down at the floor. "They've been messing with me and Max for a while now, but today they went too far." His voice trailed off as he thought back to the moment when he had seen Max hurt. He could still hear the bullies laughing, the sound echoing in his ears. It made his stomach turn just thinking about it. His mom's face softened, and she pulled him into a hug. "You don't have to go through things like this alone, Elijah. I know it's hard, but you have to remember that you're stronger than you think." She paused for a moment, pulling back to look him in the eye. "And I know you didn't want to fight, but sometimes you have to stand up for yourself. I'm proud of you for protecting Max." Elijah nodded, grateful for her words, but a part of him still felt conflicted. He had never been the type to resort to violence. He had always believed in turning the other cheek, but that didn't work with the bullies at school. They weren't interested in peace. They were interested in tearing him down. And for the first time, Elijah had fought back, not just for himself, but for Max. As they sat down to dinner, the weight of the day still hung heavily on Elijah's shoulders. He didn't know what to expect tomorrow. Would the bullies leave him alone, or would they come looking for more trouble? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but he didn't want to dwell on it. He had survived today, and that was something. Max, lying contentedly at his feet, was safe, and that was what mattered most. Later that night, as Elijah lay in bed, his mind wandered back to the fight. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed inside him. It wasn't just about defending Max. It was about realizing that he didn't have to be afraid anymore. The bullies had tried to break him, to make him feel small and insignificant, but he hadn't let them. For the first time, Elijah felt a sense of power over his own life, over his own destiny. He closed his eyes and thought about what his mom had said. He was stronger than he thought. And maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to believe it. The next morning, as Elijah prepared to leave for school, he felt a sense of unease settle in his chest. He wasn't sure what to expect. Would the bullies come after him again? Would they try to make him pay for standing up for himself? He didn't know, but he was determined not to let fear control him. He had faced down the worst of it, and he wasn't going to back down now. Max looked up at him from his bed, his eyes calm and steady. Elijah smiled softly at the dog, feeling a sense of gratitude wash over him. He wasn't alone in this fight. He had Max, and he had his own strength, and that was more than enough. The morning air was crisp as Elijah stepped outside, Max by his side. The sun had just started to rise, casting long shadows across the street. It was still early, and the world felt quiet. Elijah had always liked mornings. There was something peaceful about them, a sense of possibility that came with the new day. But today, that peace was overshadowed by the thoughts running through his mind. What would today bring? Elijah had never been one to worry about what others thought of him, but after the fight with the bullies, he felt a weight on his shoulders. He didn't know how they would react or what they would do next. Would they leave him alone, or would they come after him again? Part of him hoped they would forget about it, that they would just move on and find someone else to target. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be that easy. Bullies didn't forget quickly, especially when they were embarrassed. As they walked toward school, Elijah tried to push the thoughts out of his mind. He focused on Max, the steady rhythm of the dog's paws against the pavement, a comforting sound. Max was always there, a constant presence in Elijah's life. And in moments like this, when the world felt uncertain, that was all that mattered. When they reached the school gates, Elijah hesitated for a moment. He could see the group of bullies gathered near the entrance, laughing and talking among themselves. The sight of them made his stomach tighten, but he refused to let it show. He had faced them before, and he could do it again. He wasn't afraid anymore. Max nudged his hand as if sensing his unease. Elijah smiled down at the dog, grateful for the unspoken comfort. "Thanks, buddy," he whispered. Max's tail wagged in response, and Elijah felt a little more confident as he walked through the gates and toward his first class. The day started off as usual, with the hum of students chatting, teachers calling attendance, and the constant shuffle of feet in the hallways. But it wasn't long before Elijah felt the eyes of the bullies on him. They didn't say anything at first, but their stares were enough to make Elijah feel self-conscious. He tried to keep his head down, to focus on his work, but it was hard to ignore the sense of tension in the air. At lunch, Elijah sat at his usual spot in the cafeteria, alone. It wasn't that he minded being alone, it was easier that way. But today it felt different. The bullies had noticed him again. They were sitting a few tables away, whispering among themselves, and Elijah could hear snippets of their conversation. "Think he'll fight back again today?" one of them said, their voice dripping with sarcasm. "Yeah, like he's some kind of tough guy now," another one laughed. Elijah didn't look at them. He didn't want to give them the satisfaction of knowing that their words were getting to him. Instead, he focused on his food, trying to block them out. But it was hard. He knew they were watching him, waiting for him to react. Max, who had been lying quietly under the table, suddenly sat up, his ears perked as he sensed the tension. Elijah reached down and gently stroked his dog's fur, trying to calm himself. Max had always been able to sense when something was wrong, and today was no different. Then, without warning, the leader of the bullies stood up and walked over to Elijah's table. He smirked down at him, his eyes cold and challenging. "You think you're tough now, huh?" the boy sneered. "Just because you got lucky the other day?" Elijah didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure what to say. Part of him wanted to ignore the boy, to just walk away and leave it behind. But another part of him knew that wasn't going to happen. The bullies weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted, and that was control over him. They wanted to see him break, to make him feel weak. "I'm not looking for trouble," Elijah said quietly, his voice steady but firm. "I'm just here to eat." The boy laughed as if Elijah's words were a joke. "Oh, you're not looking for trouble? But you've already made trouble for yourself." He took a step closer, towering over Elijah. "You think people are going to forget what happened the other day? You think you're a hero now?" Elijah met the boy's gaze, trying to hold his ground. He had been taught to keep his cool, to stay calm in the face of adversity. But today he felt something different inside him. He wasn't afraid anymore. "I didn't do it for attention," Elijah said, his voice growing stronger. "I did it because you hurt my dog, and I won't let anyone hurt him again." The boy's smirk faltered for a moment, but then he leaned in closer, his voice low and menacing. "You think you're tough, but you're nothing. You're just a freak who got lucky, and we'll make sure everyone knows that." Elijah didn't respond. He knew better than to engage with the boy any further. Instead, he stood up, grabbed his lunch tray, and walked away. He could feel the boy's eyes on him as he left, but he didn't look back. He wasn't going to let them have control over him anymore. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Elijah kept his head down, focused on his classes, and tried to ignore the whispers that followed him through the halls. It was hard, but he managed. Max was waiting for him when school ended, and as soon as he saw the dog, Elijah felt a wave of relief. No matter what happened, Max would always be there for him. That evening, Elijah sat in his room, thinking about the day. He had expected the bullies to cause trouble, but something about today had felt different. It wasn't just the usual taunting and teasing. There was a deeper malice in their words, a hunger for control. They wanted to break him, to make him feel like he didn't belong. And for a moment, Elijah wondered if they would ever stop. But then he thought about the fight. He thought about how he had stood up for himself and for Max, how he had refused to let the bullies win. It wasn't about being tough or showing off. It was about standing his ground, about knowing when to fight and when to walk away. Elijah had never been one to back down from what he believed in, and that hadn't changed. The next day, Elijah woke up early, the thoughts of the bullies still fresh in his mind. But as he got ready for school, he felt something else stirring inside him, something he hadn't felt before. It was a sense of purpose. He wasn't going to let the bullies dictate his life anymore. He wasn't going to let them control his actions or his emotions. He was going to take control of his own destiny starting today. Max wagged his tail as Elijah grabbed his leash and headed out the door. The dog was always ready, always eager for the next adventure. Elijah smiled, feeling the weight of his decisions lift just a little bit. Today was going to be different. The following days were a mix of tension and relief for Elijah. He tried his best to keep his head down and focus on his studies, but it was hard not to feel the eyes of the bullies on him. They seemed to be watching him from every corner, waiting for him to slip up or show any sign of weakness. But Elijah refused to give them the satisfaction. He knew that if he stayed strong, they would eventually back off. They were just trying to provoke him, trying to get under his skin, and he wasn't going to let that happen. At lunch, he sat in the same spot as always, but this time, he wasn't alone. Max had become his constant companion, accompanying him everywhere he went, even to school. He wasn't allowed to bring Max into the building, but the dog waited outside, patiently watching through the windows, as if guarding Elijah from the world. Max was more than just a dog now. He was Elijah's shield, his protection from the harshness of the world around him. And every time Elijah saw the dog's calm, steady gaze, he felt a little stronger, a little more confident. Max didn't care about the bullies or what they said. Max cared about Elijah. That was all that mattered. One afternoon, as Elijah sat outside with Max, the group of bullies approached him again. He had been expecting it, but it didn't make it any easier to face them. This time, they didn't say anything right away. They just stood there watching him, their eyes filled with a mix of anger and confusion. It was clear that they were trying to figure out what to do next. The leader of the group, the boy who had been the most vocal in the past, stepped forward. He looked at Elijah with a sneer on his face, but there was something different in his expression this time. It wasn't the same arrogance that had marked their previous encounters. There was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, a hint that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't sure how to handle Elijah anymore. "You really think you're something, don't you?" the boy said, his voice low and threatening. Elijah didn't respond immediately. He didn't want to give the boy the satisfaction of seeing him angry or upset. Instead, he simply met the boy's gaze, calm and steady. "I don't think I'm anything," Elijah said quietly. "I just don't want trouble. But I won't let anyone hurt me or my dog." The boy's face twisted into a scowl. He clearly didn't like being talked to like that, but he seemed unsure of how to react. For a moment, there was an awkward silence, and the other bullies shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Elijah and their leader. Elijah could see that they were starting to lose their confidence. They hadn't expected him to stand firm, to speak so calmly in the face of their cruelty. Max, sensing the change in the atmosphere, stood up and walked over to Elijah's side, his tail wagging slowly. The dog's presence seemed to make the bullies nervous, and they instinctively took a step back. Max wasn't a vicious dog, but he had a way of making people feel uncomfortable if they meant harm. And right now, the bullies could feel the protective energy that Max exuded. The leader of the group seemed to falter, his bravado slipping away as he looked down at the ground. He muttered something under his breath, but Elijah couldn't hear it clearly. He didn't need to. It was obvious that the bully was running out of things to say. He had been hoping to provoke Elijah, to make him react, but all he had gotten in return was calm resolve. After a few more moments of awkward silence, the leader of the group finally turned and walked away, followed by the other bullies. They didn't say another word to Elijah, and as they left, Elijah felt a strange sense of victory. It wasn't the kind of victory that came from winning a fight. It wasn't about proving who was stronger or tougher. It was about something deeper, about standing his ground, about refusing to let them have power over him anymore. As they walked away, Elijah looked down at Max, who had returned to his spot beside him, content and calm. Elijah reached down and scratched the dog's ears, his heart swelling with gratitude. He knew that Max was the reason he had been able to stay calm, the reason he had been able to stand up to the bullies without losing his temper. Max had been with him through everything, and Elijah had learned a valuable lesson from the dog. Sometimes, the best way to fight back is to remain calm, to not let others control your emotions. Later that evening, as Elijah sat with his mom at the dinner table, he couldn't help but smile. She had noticed the change in him too. She had seen how he had carried himself differently after that first confrontation with the bullies. There was a quiet strength in him now, something that had been there all along but had never fully come to the surface until recently. "Everything okay at school today?" his mom asked, looking at him with a knowing smile. Elijah nodded. "Yeah, it was fine. No problems." His mom raised an eyebrow as if she didn't quite believe him, but she didn't press the issue. She knew that sometimes Elijah preferred to keep things to himself, but she also knew that he had been through a lot lately, and she couldn't help but feel proud of how he had handled everything. "I'm glad to hear that," she said softly. "I know things haven't been easy, but I want you to know that I'm always here for you, okay?" Elijah smiled and nodded, feeling the warmth of her words sink into his chest. He had always known that his mom had his back, but lately, he had come to realize that he was stronger than he had given himself credit for. He didn't need to rely on others to protect him. He had the strength to stand up for himself, and he had Max to help him when things got tough. As the days passed, the bullies stopped bothering Elijah. They didn't approach him in the halls anymore, and they didn't try to provoke him at lunch. Elijah wasn't sure why they had backed off, but he wasn't about to question it. It felt good to know that he had faced them down and come out on top, not through force or violence, but through the simple act of standing his ground. And with each passing day, Elijah felt more confident, more sure of who he was and what he stood for. He had learned that strength wasn't just about physical power. It was about inner resolve, about knowing when to stand firm and when to walk away. And with Max by his side, Elijah knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would face them with calm confidence and unwavering strength. Weeks passed, and the tension that had once gripped Elijah seemed to fade with each passing day. The bullies who had once tormented him had disappeared from his life, and the school days that had once been filled with anxiety and fear now felt like just another part of his routine. Elijah had learned to move through his days with a sense of calm confidence, a quiet strength that he hadn't known he possessed until recently. The change hadn't just been about standing up to the bullies, though. It was about the way he had come to understand himself. For the first time in his life, Elijah had realized that he didn't need to be afraid of the world around him. He didn't need to shrink back when others tried to push him down. He didn't have to prove anything to anyone. He just had to be himself. Max, ever the loyal companion, had been with him every step of the way. The dog's presence had been a constant reminder that Elijah wasn't alone. They had been through so much together, and the bond between them had only grown stronger. Max had always been there for Elijah, not just as a pet but as a true friend, someone who understood him without needing words. There were times when Elijah found himself talking to Max, sharing his thoughts and frustrations, and the dog would listen, his calm eyes reassuring Elijah that everything would be okay. One afternoon, as Elijah walked home from school, he couldn't help but notice how different everything felt. The streets were quieter than usual, the houses lined up in neat rows with their lawns perfectly trimmed. He glanced down at Max, who was walking beside him, his tail wagging gently. Elijah had always loved this part of the walk, the peaceful time between school and home when the world seemed to slow down. But today something felt different. There was a sense of closure in the air, like a chapter of his life was finally coming to an end. Max stopped suddenly, sniffing the air as if he sensed something Elijah hadn't. The dog looked up at him with those steady, knowing eyes, and Elijah smiled. Reaching down to pat him on the head. "What is it, buddy?" he murmured. Max didn't answer, of course, but the dog's ears twitched and he began to walk with a little more purpose. Elijah followed without question, curious about what had caught his dog's attention. As they rounded the corner, Elijah spotted a familiar face standing in front of his house. It was one of the bullies from the group, the one who had been the most vocal and the most arrogant. The boy was standing on the sidewalk, looking uneasy, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. He was alone, and there was no sign of the others. Elijah's heart skipped a beat, unsure of what to expect. Max growled softly, sensing the tension, but Elijah quickly placed a hand on his dog's back to calm him down. This wasn't the time for a fight. The boy had his head down, not looking at Elijah at first, but when he finally did, there was something different in his eyes. There was no arrogance, no mocking smile. There was only a look of regret. "Elijah," the boy said quietly, his voice hesitant. "I need to talk to you." Elijah stood still for a moment, unsure of how to react. After everything that had happened, he never expected the boy to approach him like this, let alone ask to talk. The last time they had spoken, the boy had been nothing but cruel, and now he was standing there waiting for Elijah's response. "Why?" Elijah asked, his voice calm but guarded. The boy swallowed hard, looking down at his feet before meeting Elijah's eyes again. I just wanted to say I'm sorry," he said, his words coming out slower than Elijah had expected. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I know I messed up." "We all did." Elijah blinked in surprise. For a moment he wasn't sure if he had heard the boy correctly. This wasn't the kind of apology he had imagined, if he had even thought about it at all, but there was sincerity in the boy's voice, something Elijah hadn't heard before. "I shouldn't have picked on you," the boy continued, his voice low, "and I shouldn't have messed with your dog. I was just trying to fit in with the others, and I got caught up in it. I don't know why I thought it was okay to treat you like that." Elijah didn't know what to say. He had expected the boy to make some excuse to try and shift the blame, but instead the apology felt genuine. It didn't take away everything that had happened, but it was a start. Elijah had never been one to hold grudges, but the past few weeks had been difficult. Still, he understood what it was like to make mistakes, to do things out of fear or pressure, and in that moment, he realized that forgiveness wasn't just about letting go of the past. It was about moving forward. "I don't want to hold on to the past," Elijah said finally, his voice steady, "but I won't forget what happened either." He paused, giving the boy a moment to absorb his words. "It's going to take time, but I appreciate your apology. Just don't hurt anyone else like that, okay?" The boy nodded, his face softening with relief. "I won't, I promise." He turned to leave, but then paused and glanced back at Elijah. "You're not so bad, you know. I always thought you were just some quiet kid, but you're stronger than I gave you credit for." Elijah didn't respond, but he gave the boy a small nod of acknowledgement. As the boy walked away, Elijah felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't the apology he had been waiting for, but it was enough. The boy had taken responsibility for his actions, and that was more than Elijah had expected. As Max and Elijah walked back toward the house, Elijah couldn't help but feel a little lighter. The weight that had been on his shoulders for so long was finally starting to lift. He had stood up for himself, he had protected the people and things he cared about, and now he could let go of the past. When they reached the front door, Elijah opened it slowly, Max stepping inside first. He paused for a moment, looking back at the quiet street behind him. Everything had changed. He had changed. And for the first time in a long time, Elijah felt like he was ready for whatever came next. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he could face it with the strength he had discovered within himself. Max would always be there by his side, a reminder of the bond they shared and the lessons they had learned together. Elijah wasn't just a quiet kid anymore. He was someone who had found his voice, who had learned that standing up for what was right didn't always mean fighting. It sometimes meant forgiving, moving forward and being the person you were always meant to be. With Max at his feet, Elijah stepped inside and closed the door behind him, ready to take on whatever came next.